Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my in-depth review of the Sigma 24-70mm f2.8 DGDN II Art. Announced in May 2024, this new Mark II version arrives 4.5 years after the original model and costs around $1,200 or pounds. At the time I made this review, it was only available in Sony E and Leica L mounts, but we can keep our fingers crossed for other versions in the future. Like other 24-70 2.8 lenses, it delivers a classic general-purpose range on full-frame cameras with a bright aperture that makes it a flexible favourite for portrait, wedding and event photographers. Now, there's no shortage of similar specification lenses around. If you own a Sony body, their most recent Mark II G Master from 2022 is one of the best I've tested, albeit at a correspondingly high price of $2,300 or around £2,000, and that makes it almost double the price of the new Sigma. Meanwhile, L-mount owners have Panasonic's Lumix S Pro version for around $1,700 or pounds, or the Leica Vario Elmarit SL for just under $3,000. For those on a tighter budget, the Mark I versions of both Sigma and Sony's 24-70 2.8 lenses are still available, as are a variety of alternative ranges, such as Sigma's 28-70 2.8 or Tamron's 28-75 2.8, both available for less than £1,000. But in terms of brand new 24-70 2.8 zooms, the latest Sigma becomes one of the most affordable while including a number of key improvements over its predecessor. So let's find out what it can do. Designed, manufactured and assembled at Sigma's Seoul factory in Japan, the build quality is excellent. Like their other lenses, it's made from what Sigma describes as a thermally stable composite material, and as an art lens it's sealed against dust and moisture, including a rubber grommet at the mount. Measuring 88mm in diameter and 122mm long, it's essentially the same size as Sony's GM Mark II version, with both being a few mil shorter than the original Mark I Sigma. Weighing 734 grams, Sigma's managed to make a decent reduction over the 827 grams of its predecessor, and while Sony's GM II beats them both at an impressive 695 grams, it's not a huge difference once it's in your hands. That said, both Sony and Sigma are now showing up Nikon and Canon on weight, with their mirrorless 24-70 2.8 zooms weighing in at a relatively hefty 805 and 900 grams respectively. Okay, so let's have a look at the design. Starting at the mount end of the new Sigma, you'll find an aperture ring running between f2.8 and f22 in third stop increments. It's interesting to recall the original Sigma and Sony versions didn't actually have aperture rings, but now both companies have added them to their Mark II versions, proving that there is demand for this type of control. Like Sony's, the ring is declickable for smoother and quieter adjustments, while a lockable A position allows body-based operation if preferred. Next comes the zoom ring, which turns smoothly and extends the barrel by around 35mm at the longest focal length. This is lockable at the 24mm focal length to avoid unwanted extensions, although the barrel and control weren't loose when new. Note that a firm twist to the zoom ring will deactivate the lock. This portion of the lens, between the zoom and focusing rings, is also where you'll find an autofocus or manual focus switch and a pair of programmable focus hold buttons. Finally, at the end of the barrel is a free spinning manual focusing ring, which feels lighter than the zoom ring and allows very precise adjustments. Like most 24-70 2.8 zooms, there's an 82mm filter thread, and Sigma supplies a petal lens hood which twists onto the end of the barrel, and while this may lack the window that's on Sony's hood to operate rotating filters, it does include a lock button to release it. Sigma also supplies a padded bag for transportation, albeit not when the lens is mounted to a body. And speaking of bodies, I tested the E-mount version of the lens on a Sony a7 IV. Like most modern mirrorless lenses, it's designed to be used with a profile to correct distortion, so this was set to auto in the Sony lens correction menus for all of my tests. Just briefly though, this profile corrects a little bit of barrel distortion at the wide end, with a tiny reduction in the field of view, while at the long end of the range it corrects a little pincushion distortion. In general use, it's applied automatically to JPEGs, and it's also available in updated RAW converters. Okay, so let's start with focusing, and you're looking at the Sigma 24-70 at 24-2.8, positioned pretty close to the bottle and set to single AFS mode, where the focusing is pretty quick with no visible hunting. Change the focus mode to continuous AFC mode though, and the Sony switches to phase detect autofocus only, with essentially instant results between the bottle and the background. Next for the lens at 70mm 2.8, again starting in single AFS mode, where there's a tiny wobble before the lens and camera refocuses on the subject. Switch the camera to continuous AFC mode again though, and the speed is again increased to become essentially instant. Sigma says that they're using a redesigned high-response linear actuator for focusing, and it's certainly performing very well here. And for those who are interested in video performance, here's a 4K clip filmed at 24mm 2.8, showing smooth and confident focus pulls between the bottle and the wall. And now for a version at 70mm 2.8, again smoothly refocusing without any wobbles or other issues. Next for focus breathing, starting at 24mm and manually focusing from infinity to the closest distance of 17cm and back again. As I focus closer, you'll see the field of view widen a little, but across typical focus pulling distances, I'd say it'll be barely visible. And now at 70mm, again focusing from infinity to the closest distance, this time of 34cm and back again, where the impact of breathing is even lower. In fact, I'd say it's not going to be an issue in general use here, which is good news since the breathing compensation of recent Sony bodies only works with Sony's own lenses, so that's a benefit that the Sony 24-70 GM has over the Sigma. Next for stabilization, and while the lens doesn't have optical compensation of its own, it can still be useful to see how well it works with body-based IBIS and digital stabilization systems. So first, here's a view through the camera during composition with the lens set to 70mm, initially with steady shot IBIS disabled, where the view can get pretty wobbly. Before, I now enable steady shot in the menus and return to a view that is much more stable, making it much easier to frame accurately. Like most stabilization systems, it's worth waiting a moment or two for the full effect to kick in. Here's a shot I took at 70mm and a shutter speed of 1/10 of a second using IBIS on the A7 IV. This was the slowest I could handhold with IBIS and enjoy a perfectly sharp result, although my test at 1/5 of a second was also very close. I'll now put this on the left and the same exposure without IBIS on the right to show the difference. I actually needed a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second to match my result on the left without IBIS on the day, thereby representing around 4 to 4.5 stops of compensation. Just briefly, here's a video clip filmed with the lens at 70mm but without IBIS, where you can see how shaky it looks. Next, here it is with IBIS alone on the A7 IV, where you can see the footage has become much steadier. And finally, you're looking at IBIS and active steady shot, which applies extra digital compensation in return for a crop. Now, I find that active steady shot works best of all with Sony's own lenses, especially when vlogging or moving the camera, but it's certainly usable here, just perhaps not quite as good as you'd see on one of Sony's own lenses. Now for my image quality tests, starting with my distant landscape view of Brighton Pier, angled as always so that details run right into the corners. This image was taken at 24mm 2.8, so let's now zoom in for a closer look. Here you can see nice sharp details in the middle of the frame where the camera was focused for this shot, with nothing to really complain about. Stopping the lens down to f4 or 5.6 has minimal impact on the image, proving that it's great in the middle right out of the gate. So let's return to the f2.8 image before heading out into the far corner, where you'll notice some darkening due to vignetting. That said, the details are still looking pretty crisp, and as I gradually close the aperture, the biggest gain you'll find is to reducing that vignette. So a solid start for the lens at its widest focal length. Next, here's the lens zoomed to the 35mm focal length, so let's take a closer look at the middle, again where the camera was focused. Here you can see the details are still nice and crisp, as it was at 24mm, and if I close down the aperture, there's little, if anything, to be gained in the middle of the frame. So let's go back to the f2.8 version before again heading into the far corner once more. Here, along with the expected darkening due to vignetting, I'd say the details have become a little softer, but it's not bad by any means, and as I close the aperture to f4, then to 5.6 and to 8, you'll see that corner sharpness improve. Next, here's the lens at the 50mm focal length, so let's take a closer look in the middle. And like the previous focal length, it's looking nice and sharp out of the gate at f2.8. And as I close down the aperture, there's little to be gained here in the middle of the frame. So it's back to the f2.8 version before heading into the far corners once more. Here you'll again notice some darkening as well as a little bit of softening of the finest details. Closing the aperture gradually improves this though, with the sharpness peaking in the corner here at f8. And finally to the longest end of the range at 70mm 2.8 before taking a close look in the middle of the frame. Here there's plenty of detail, albeit lacking the ultimate crispness that I recorded at the shorter focal lengths. It's good, but it's not quite as good. Viewed in isolation, I'd say it's fine, but closing the aperture one stop to f4 brings a visible boost in sharpness and contrast, with milder further improvements at f5.6 and f8. Returning to the f2.8 image and heading into the corners shows a similar degree of detail to the centre at this aperture, and a mild degree of darkening due to vignetting. Close the aperture to f4 and you'll enjoy a boost in sharpness and reduced vignetting, with further, albeit milder improvements available at 5.6 and f8. Now, all of the images that are presented here were taken with the lens focused in the middle of the frame, but I repeated them all with the lens focused in the far corner instead, and I actually found very similar results, and that proves that it enjoys a pretty flat field. Moving on, portraits are the bread and butter of 24 to 70 zooms, so here I am at 70mm 2.8 from a typical distance, where you can get an idea of the background blur and rendering style. Looking closely, it may lack the bite of the sharpest lenses that I've tested, but that's not necessarily a bad thing for portraits. There's certainly plenty of detail around my eyes and my stubble, with smooth rendering behind me. Let's now pop the Sigma on the left and the Sony GM II on the right for a quick comparison. Now, I've used different bodies here, and obviously the posing and framing is a bit different too, not to mention there being 2 years between them, but you can still get an idea of their respective styles. The Sony lens is crisper on the details, partly thanks to the Alpha 1 body that I used for my tests with it, but from this distance I'd say they're actually looking quite similar in overall rendering style. Do you have a preference? The lens is also ideal for presenting pieces to camera, and here's how it looks at 70mm 2.8, where you'll enjoy some decent separation from the background. Or how about at 24mm 2.8 if you'd like to capture more of the environment around you. This works fine from a tripod when you can stand a little further back, but as you can see from this clip, filmed handheld at arm's length with IBIS alone, the 24 focal length isn't quite wide enough for vlogging, especially if you'd like to apply additional digital compensation. Moving on to better evaluate the background rendering, here's my ornament and fairy light test with the Sigma at 70mm 2.8 and focused as close as it can at this focal length, and that's 34cm. The bokeh blobs at f2.8 from this distance are large and well behaved, with minimal evidence of outlining or undesirable onion ring textures within. Closing the aperture one stop at a time shows the blobs becoming more uniformly round, with the 11-bladed diaphragm system mostly keeping out of the way and avoiding any obvious geometric shapes. As another quick comparison, here's the Sigma on the left and the Sony GM II on the right, both at 70mm 2.8 and from their closest focusing distances. The Sony can actually focus a little closer from 30cm at this focal length, in turn delivering slightly larger blobs. And you'll also notice its rendering style has crisper edges. Now, there's no right or wrong way here, just different approaches and different preferences, so is there one that you prefer of the other? And before moving on, here's both lenses at 24mm 2.8, again from their closest focusing distances, but this time it's the Sigma on the left that can focus closer to an impressive 17cm compared to 21cm on the Sony. At the other end of the aperture range, here's a quick video clip that I filmed with the Sigma at 24mm f22 to show its potential for sunstars. The spikes are nice and crisp here, although do notice the faint circular flare when I'm pointed directly at the sun with it in the middle of the frame. My final test is for macro capabilities, focusing as close to a ruler as the lens would allow. First at 24mm, where the 17cm minimum distance means your subject will only be about 2cm from the very front of the lens. Now, inevitably it's going to cast shadows at this distance, but the result at f8 here is still pretty impressive, delivering 97mm across the frame. And now for the lens set to 70mm, again from its minimum focusing distance, this time of 34cm, where it's delivering slightly reduced magnification with 128mm across the frame. Note, from these closest distances the details can become a little bit soft at the edges at larger apertures, so you will want to close down for the best results. Both my ruler images were taken at f8, but if your subject keeps away from the edges, you could get away with larger apertures. Just make sure that that subject's near the middle. Okay, now it's time for my verdict, during which I'll show a selection of sample images. As always, I'll add a few of them to my review page at cameralabs.com if you'd like a closer look. Overall, the Sigma 24-70 2.8 DGDN2 Art is a very impressive lens for the money, delivering worthy upgrades over the original model to become one of the best general purpose or event lenses at this price point. Compared to its predecessor, it's sharper across the frame and throughout its range. It enjoys faster focusing and features more controls, including a declickable aperture ring, all packed into a weather-sealed barrel that's 10% lighter than before. Indeed, it comes very close to Sony's own 24-70G Master II version, which is the best 24-70 2.8 I've tested to date. In my test, the Sony still enjoys a mild edge in sharpness, particularly at 70mm 2.8, but I was struck how close they were in overall performance, quality, and rendering. As a third-party lens, do remember that the Sigma won't support the fastest burst speeds with continuous autofocus on the top-end Sony bodies, but if you've invested in an A1 or A9 series camera, you're almost certainly going to be going for one of Sony's own lenses anyway. Sigma's lens also won't support Sony's focus breathing correction, but in my test proved to be pretty well behaved in this regard, so it's not really a problem. And while active stabilization also works best with Sony's own lenses, few of us are going to be handheld vlogging at 24mm as it's just not wide enough. So while the Sony 24-70 GM II remains the best overall 24-70 I've tested, I'd say Sigma's DGDN Mark II version is easily good enough for most of us, especially those using the more affordable bodies. And the best part is it costs just over half of the Sony lens, making it a relative bargain. As I said at the start, there's loads of other options, including Mark I versions of both lenses and slightly different ranges available at lower prices. But if you're looking for the classic 24-70 range with an f2.8 aperture, the Sigma DGDN Mark II becomes the best option under $1,500. And that's it for another lens review. I hope you found it useful, particularly my outdoor resolution tests with a distant subject, as they do involve quite a lot of work. I think it's worth it though. And in the absence of a sponsor, if you enjoy what I do here, don't forget to like the video and consider giving me a sub so that you don't miss out on all of my latest reviews. Do let me know what you think of this Sigma in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.